Dear learners, let me welcome you to this session on channels of distribution. Channels of distribution are important participants in the marketing of goods and services, and they form a very essential part of the value chain for an organization. Before starting, let's identify what are the learning outcomes that I expect you to be able to display as you go through this session. You should be able to discuss the importance and rationale for channels of distribution. Should be able to say why, if at all, should we have channels of distribution. You should also be able to give a definition of a channel of distribution and be able to explain what are the different types of channels that are used by businessmen. There are several flows that are transacted through these channels. You should be able to explain and identify what are the different flows that are transacted through channels. In addition, you should also be able to describe what are the different functions that channel members perform and how do they add value to the entire marketing network. Let's first answer the question, why should we have channels in the first place? The term channels of distribution is loosely applied to the network and system of institutions that come together to enable the movement and delivery of goods and services from the point of production to the point of consumption by performing a series of interrelated activities and interrelated services, and therefore they become a very valuable part of the value network. I'm sure you would have done the value chain by Michael Porter in your initial exposure to concepts of marketing. Now, if you look at the outbound and inbound value network components, all of them are actually contributed by channels of distribution. So, when a manufacturer provides firm utility by producing a product, those products are produced at centers which are far removed from the centers of consumption. Goods are produced at specific times, but they may be consumed far more regularly. They may be produced by a very few number of producers and manufacturers, but they are consumed by a huge, large, dispersed population of consumers. So there is a disparity or discrepancy between the points of production and points of consumption. The agencies that are used to connect these dots are channels of distribution. They therefore perform a very important function of creating time and place utility. As we just said, the form utility is created by the manufacturer. He creates the product and gives it a form, gives it a packaging, gives it a branding, gives it a brand image. Now, for all of these values to be enjoyed by the customer has to have the products in his hands. Now, since the points of production may be concentrated in certain areas, but the consumers are spread over the entire population. How do we remove this spatial discrepancy of space? They are removed in space. They are also removed in time, in the sense production runs are at times which are far removed from the time of consumption, because consumption is more or less a regular activity. Production may respond to certain production cycles. Therefore, there is a time-related discrepancy and there is a space-related discrepancy. Channels of distribution come in where they take the goods from the manufacturers and move it closer to the consumers in a series of contractual relationship. I mean, as they move closer to the consumer, they build up assortments which are closer to what the consumer really desires. There is something called bulk breaking and bulk making, or creating of assortments. We'll be talking about this a little later. So channels of distribution essentially are used because they are able to remove this discrepancy between time and place of production and the time and place where consumption is actually desired. So to create time and place utility, channels of distribution perform this important function of taking the goods from points of production to the points of consumption. And therefore, we come to the second point, the function of sorting. Now, manufacturers would be producing limited number of product lines, whereas in order to have their daily lives, consumers require a variety of goods and services in a certain assortment. The function of the wholesalers and retailers, if you see it from the macroeconomic point, is to take supplies from various kinds of manufacturers and break this bulk into smaller assortments so that it can be transported to various retailers. They also, at given points in time, create desired assortments by bringing in items from the different manufacturers together into a desired assortment for the consumer. So as you move from the wholesaler to the retailer, the assortments are becoming closer to what is desired by the customers in different kinds of markets. So as you move closer to the customers, your assortment becomes more responsive to the existing consumer demands in that particular pocket or that particular geographical locality or that particular target market. So this function of sorting is what is called alternative breaking and making of bulk. So you bring in the wholesalers and larger agents bring in goods and goods from various manufacturers and then break this bulk to then create desired assortments while the goods and services are being moved closer to the consumer. The next reason why we need to have channels of distribution is that they take huge marketing risks of holding the goods till they can be sold, sometimes becoming important participants in creation of demand by advising consumers, holding of inventory and so on. So all the risks that are associated with holding of inventory, holding of stock, the stocks remaining unsold, all of these risks are those that are borne by the channels of distribution. So they become an important part of the value chain of supply between the manufacturer and the consumer. I must bring in one point here, which is the second following bullet, where we've been talking about these are members that take the goods from the point of production to the point of consumption, but this is a fairly standard definition of channels of distribution. But today we extend this definition to cover the entire supply chain. That means inbound logistics. When the manufacturer produces these goods, he also needs raw material supplies, other accessories and so on. So all that part, the raw materials coming in from the suppliers to various depots, coming to the manufacturer and other accessories coming in, all of that together is also part of the supply chain network that we now, the term that we now use to cover channels of distribution. So both inbound and outbound supplies and delivery are covered in channels of distribution. Okay, now if we are looking at this channel of distribution as a network of institution that is engaged in movement, storage and transportation, transfer of title, everything from the manufacturer to the consumer, who are the people who participate in this channel? So a typical channel, I'm talking about very generically, when you're referring to a channel of distribution, the participants or this value network that is contributed by the supply chain, the participants would be manufacturers because they are the one who give form utility, they produce the goods and services. Then there is this important group of institutions which we call the intermediaries. These could be wholesalers, retailers, agents, warehousing people or warehouses, and transportation agencies. So together they create various functions or perform various functions so that the movement of goods from the manufacturer to the consumer can be facilitated. All inbound suppliers, that means people who bring in raw material to the manufacturer so that the goods can be produced, people who bring in the packaging supplies or are the packaging fabricators, they're all part of the value chain. So this is the inbound logistics or inbound supplies. Who are the logistics participants? The logistics participants are actually all the third-party transport agencies. They could be airways, waterways, roadways, railways, all of these logistics partners that help move goods over long distances or short distance or whatever the case may be. But anyone who's involved in creating this logistical support is included in the logistical participants. The next category of people are the facilitating agencies. Now, when goods are moving, they would need to be insured. They would also need, you would also need finances to cover some of these investments that are there in inventory and so on. So banks, insurance agents are all examples of facilitating agencies. Carry and forward agents are all examples of facilitating agencies that facilitate this entire value network by providing essential risk supporting services. Then, of course, the final destination is that of the consumer. So at one end is the manufacturer, the other end is the consumer, and in between there are so many different participants who come in together. Of course, the inbound suppliers would be at a stage that precedes manufacturing. So this is the whole value network that we are talking about when we are discussing channels of distribution. Now, it is also a good idea to basically look at a channel as a system of flows. You know, if you could think of a sort of a large pipeline through which several things flow, because when you buy goods and services, there are several things that, apart from the goods that you physically possess as a result of your transaction, there is a flow of information, there is a flow of payments, there is a flow of negotiations, and there is a flow of ownership. You know, ownership, if you can see, look at this chart which is on your screen for a reference point. The first flow that we are talking about is product flow. So from the manufacturer, it may go to wholesalers, it may go to retailers, and ultimately reach the consumption point or reach the buying point where the consumers can come and buy it. Similarly, there is a lot of information flow, the information that is created by the producer of goods and services, and through certain agencies, and also partly through the agency of these intermediaries comes to the point of the consumer. Of course, there may be very direct channels of information communication, which is mass media and so on, but right now some of the information that flow, some of the flows that come through the channel also include the information flow. Then you have the title flow, which is the ownership flow. The initial ownership or the title belongs to the manufacturer. There are two kinds of intermediaries as far as the title flow is concerned or ownership flow is concerned. There are agent middlemen. The agent middlemen do not take the title to the goods. They hold the title on behalf of the manufacturer, and then they give it either to the wholesaler or directly to the consumer. So as long as the agent middleman is holding the goods, he's holding them on behalf of the manufacturer before they can be given over to the consumer. The other middlemen are the merchant middlemen, and all of these we call wholesalers, retailers, and so on. Now, wholesalers and retailers actually take ownership of the goods, so they buy the title of the goods from the manufacturer, and then as they go down the channel, they transfer this title to successive owners. So the other flow, I mean the fourth flow that passes through the channels is the title flow or ownership flow, and ultimately the physical goods, the physical possession of goods and services. So all of these are the different channel flows that we talk about. That is one way of envisaging a channel. So think of it as a pipeline where several flows are taking place, and this pipeline is actually made up of several intermediaries coming together in a network that enables this flow down to the point of the consumers. Now, if you can just think of the fact that your consumers are dispersed all over, geographically dispersed all over, and they consume goods at different times. For example, a lot of toilet soap, maybe thousands of tons, but at an individual household level, maybe 4 cakes of soap in 1 month, and different members of the family may actually want different brands. So maybe 1 cake each of 4 different brands. Therefore, the channel members fulfill this important function of creating desired assortments. So as the flows are taking place, the assortments get built up to the point where the consumer can actually come and exercise his choice at the retail counter, at the mall, or wherever he's doing his shopping. Now, in present times, we've all gone through very difficult uh, COVID times. Now, in all this time, most of the supplies were very direct because you were booking your orders onto online supplies and the goods were being supplied to you. So, there the channels become very, very direct from the manufacturer to the supply aggregator and directly to you. So, there are times where these channels get shortened, but again, flows like payment flow, title flow, physical flow will still take place. Now let us quickly go through the important functions that channel members perform, and we can categorize them into two or three categories, actually three categories. The first category is that of transactional functions. These are functions related to the actual transaction of owning goods. So in order to be able to translate the title back to the consumer, the wholesalers and retailers will have to acquire the title from the manufacturer and then take it down the line. So two of the important functions they perform is buying of goods and acquiring title from the manufacturer and then selling them down the channel. So a wholesaler will sell the bulk that he's bought from the manufacturer by creating smaller assortments and sell them to various retailers who would then take it closer to the point of consumption. The retailer in turn will be selling the title of the goods to the consumers. Now, when the goods are moving down the channel, who bears the risk? You are all students of commerce and you all understand that risk always goes hand in hand with ownership. So, whoever is the owner of goods at a given point in time would also bear the risk of any kind of damage or any kind of theft related to the goods. Or any kind of obsolescence that may come in and certain goods may become obsolete. But if the wholesaler or the retailer has bought the goods and they are under his title, then he will have to bear the risk. So they perform this function of bearing the risk of possession. The last transaction function is whenever you appoint wholesalers and the business person or the owner of the goods, the producer, appoints channels of distribution, he gets into long-term contractual relationships. So, in order to carry forward these transactions, the channel members also have to perform various obligations under their contracts. For example, carrying point of promotion articles, providing ancillary services, providing advisory services, and so on. So, all those contractual obligations and keeping the goods in a certain condition. For example, a certain product requires some cold storage, those would have to be fulfilled as part of the transactional functions of the channel members. Now, we are all aware that in the channels of distribution, there is always a sense of movement. The goods are moving from the point of production to the point of consumption, and therefore certain logistical services will have to be performed. We already talked about sorting, which is bulk making and bulk breaking. So the second category of functions we are talking about is logistical functions. So moving the products, actually physical delivery of the goods closer to the consumer. Now, in order to take the goods in the desired assortment to the consumer, the wholesalers and retailers have to fulfill this function of taking bulk supplies and breaking the bulk into desired assortments which are required by certain target markets. So as you move closer to the points of consumption, you keep on building different kind of assortment that are demanded by a certain market. Just to take an example, a wholesaler of, let us say, fast moving consumer goods would be having a large number of consumer goods from a very large number of manufacturers. Now, as he builds huge supplies of all of these, he then looks at the requirements from various retailers in different parts of India. Let's say, obviously, people living in Rajasthan or Gujarat would not really be needing heavy woolens. So if we are talking about a person who's dealing in apparel, then heavy woolens would not really be required there. So while his store has everything, heavy woolens, light woolens, formals, and so on and so forth, he will then have to break this bulk into assortments that are required by different kind of retail locations, and then he will put in what is called the related items. Maybe apparel may require bags, may require shoes, and so on. So building a certain assortment for a certain retail, for a certain group of retailers in a particular geographical location, and then you get it sent to various retailers. So as you move from huge bulks at the wholesaler level, as you take the journey towards consumption points and build the assortment for different retailers, you would find that the assortments are becoming more and more responsive to the final assortments demanded by the consumer. So as you move to retailers, now what is the advantage of that? The advantage of doing this alternative bulk making and bulk breaking is that as you move closer to the target markets in different locations, your assortments will start looking different because they are now in response to the local demands. So as the advantage of that is that locally the retailers will not have supplies which are not demanded or which remain unsold because there's no demand for that, because their initial orders have been placed only on the basis of the local demand or the orders that they have been receiving, and whatever their own assessment of the local demand is. So there would be very little incidence of unsold supplies or supplies having to be sent back and so on. The second function, which is a logistics function, is holding of inventory. The goods have to be stored far ahead of consumption because you need to have a certain planning cycle before the goods can be transported to various locations. So storage as a function, and ultimately dispatching the goods to various locations. Please remember, as our information dissemination is becoming faster, the inventory holding timing is actually becoming smaller and smaller. We still in the channels of distribution haven't come to a stage where there is a just-in-time inventory, even though in manufacturing a lot of industries have graduated to JIT in channels, because the market demands and the desired assortments keep on changing. There is still some need of holding inventory. Sometimes you get unexpected large orders. Sometimes the market demand for a certain good becomes high while a certain demand flags. So that is always the requirement of holding inventory. But as I said, as the information dissemination function becomes faster, the demand for storage facilities and inventory holding is becoming smaller and smaller. Manufacturers also produce goods of different grades, I mean different quality levels and so on, and different manufacturers may actually be producing goods of various levels of quality. It's the function of the wholesaler to identify in response to the demands of the consumer, because there are all kinds of customers. There are customers who may be wanting extremely value for money, but not a very high grade product for their everyday usage. And for special occasions, the same customer may actually be wanting a high grade product. A good example is commodity rice, in the sense that for everyday usage, people who are daily rice eaters use a slightly economical grade of rice, but the same people for festive occasions or for functions in the house use a higher grade. So they need to store both. The function of the wholesaler, therefore, is to bring in various grades, store them, and get them to the point of consumption. So grading of goods and services. And again, this is also a part of building different kinds of assortments. The next and a very important function of logistics is transportation. There are all kinds of transportations that are used: road, rail, air, waterways, and so on. Transportation is an important link because it's one of the cost generator. I mean, it's a heavy cost item, and therefore a lot of transportation choices are dependent upon what is it that you can afford at a point in time. However, there are two service levels that we are talking about. One is timely delivery, and the other is unspoiled delivery. That means quality of delivery. When you're choosing your transportation, you have to look at both these criteria. Also look at your cost. What is it that you can afford, and how do you balance this? This is what is called trade-offs in the logistics function. How do you trade off cost with quality of delivery and timing of delivery? The third category of functions that channel members perform is facilitated functions. How do they advise consumers on which particular product to buy? Normally you see a lot of advisory functioning happening in pharmaceutical products, where the consumer comes and asks that, I have a very big, a very acute backache, lower back. What should I take? Which particular ointment would be better? And the pharmacist actually advises. But when new products or new brands come in, and the consumer is not very sure of what particular option to choose, he normally asks, which one of them has got a better market response. So new hair oils are hitting the market, new shampoos keep on hitting the market, and sometimes the customer asks for information and asks for advisory support. Channel members fulfill this very important function, and this is more true of retailer than of the wholesaler, because retailer is the person who's in direct contact with consumers. His proximity to the consumer also gives the retailer a certain kind of market advisory power, in the sense that at the last point he's able to actually push a lot of new products because of his reliability with the consumer. So some consumers may actually ask for his opinion, some may have a certain idea in mind, and the retailer may be able to display a new product and talk about the product and sell that product. The second facilitative function is all post-purchase service and maintenance service. For all consumer durables that require a certain post-purchase service, your retailer is also your service agent at times, unless you have appointed separate service agencies. This important function goes a long way in keeping and maintaining your consumer franchise. So this is a very important function that they perform. If you are aware of how the market functions as far as the distribution is concerned, there are terms that are used, 2 net 30 and so on, which only show that the entire channel and parts of the channel really operate on credit, in the sense when the manufacturer sells the goods to the wholesaler, he may sell the initial consignment on credit and then collect the money as the wholesaler realizes his own money from the retailers and so on. So the wholesaler in turn will be financing the retailer, and the retailer may be financing the smaller retailer. So as the consumers begin paying, or the consumers pay in cash, and as the payment goes backwards, everyone realizes the investment that they have made in these goods as they have moved from the point of production to the point of consumption. The last function that I would like to talk about is the function of market information gathering. Because the retailers are so close to the customers, they're looking at what is the product that is flying off the shelves, what are the questions that people have about products, what is it that they come and talk when they give a repeat order, and so on. They are a very, very important component of the market intelligence that the producer can collect. So this is again an important function. Information from the trade, information from the consumers, all going back to the producer, so that he can use this information in making products more responsive to the consumer's desires and his wants. Okay, there are different types of channels that are used. Basically, we talk about direct and indirect channels. If you see the leftmost part, there is the producer and the consumer. So there are goods which are sold directly by the manufacturer to the consumers. A lot of your online ordering with the manufacturer himself is an example of a direct channel. Most often than not, however, in the market, because your markets are so dispersed, you need to sometimes use channels. So there could be, if you see, there could be one level channel, there could be two level channels, or there could be three level channels. So depending upon how dispersed your market is and how many participants you want to use, you may need to have various levels in your channel. So you can have a manufacturer, a wholesaler and consumers. You may have a manufacturer, a wholesaler, several retailers and the consumer. You may have a manufacturer's agent, wholesalers, retailers and consumers. Please remember, depending upon the size of operation and the size of your market, you may need to have more than one you may need to have several participants at each level. So you may even if you're selling through an agent, you may have to appoint agents in different part of this very large country because your customers may be spread all over. However, things are a little less complicated and more direct when we are talking about industrial goods, because you are selling to another business customer. Industrial goods are those which are sold for the purposes of being used in manufacture of other goods. So you are selling for the purposes of further processing and reselling. So these are what are called industrial goods supplies. Typically, industrial goods have fairly direct channels. So you may have a manufacturer and a consumer, that means the industrial buyer. You may have a manufacturer and an agent and going directly to consumers. You may have a manufacturer, a wholesaler and going directly to consumers. Obviously, if your industrial customers are spread geographically, you may need to have wholesalers and agents in different parts of the country. And again, if there are several units which require your products, you may actually have a wholesaler, an agent as well as a wholesaler who's actually your wholesale distributor, as the term is used, and your consumer. So this is how channels for industrial goods tend to be a little shorter. The simple reason is that your consumers are also not as many in number, not as geographically dispersed, and do not have what is called widely varying cycles of consumption. So consumptions are predictable, the size of the order is more predictable, and the dispersion is not very high, so you can afford to have more direct channels of distribution. We would like to stop here, and maybe when we continue in the next session, we'll talk about how do you actually go ahead and select your channels of distribution. I'll thank you now for your attention, and we'll meet again.